Last week, a law being pushed through the Georgian Parliament, modelled on Russian legislation designed to curtail freedom of speech and stifle dissent, was prevented through the pressure of public protest. The so-called Foreign Agents Law would have required some organisations to list themselves as receiving funds from abroad, essentially flagging them as a threat to the state and society. Russia should pay attention. Public protest can force change if carried out on an appropriate scale and pursued with vigour. But the struggle against creeping authoritarianism and Russification has not been won yet. Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, and Central Asia are all a focus of Moscow's desire to influence and control the political narrative in its near abroad, ex-colonial space. But what happens when power in the Moscow center weakens, when people no longer fear the power and the threat of Muscovy? Welcome to Silicon Curtain. All our content is also available now on popular podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Please like and subscribe to help new people find our fantastic speakers. And of course, if you enjoy the content, consider supporting us by becoming a patron. We'll be adding exclusive content there, such as chats and FAQs and extended conversations with our amazing guests. Aleksandar Djokic has a PhD in political science from RUDN Moscow. He is former assistant professor at RUDN Moscow, as well as being a political analyst. In his journalistic career, he writes as a columnist at Bloomberg Adria and has also written for Nova Gazeta Europe. Aleksandar has also acted as an election observer at Transparency International, Serbia. And I really came across you on Twitter, where you make some extremely insightful and strong sort of anti-imperialist comments. And given that you've lived and worked in Russia and are a political scientist, I find some of your insights absolutely fascinating into the current war. So, Aleksandar, welcome to the channel.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Thanks for hosting this show and let me voice my opinions.
Absolutely. And of course, we're going to put a link to your Twitter channel into the description of this so people can see that. And we will put some links to your journalism, although, of course, they'll need Google Translate, I think, if they're going to read some of it. Well, we're going to start off with a few current events. And I know we're not going to go through too much on the military side. We're really going to talk much more about sort of politics. But there is an interesting and terrifying sort of events unfolding in Bakhmut, where, despite all the predictions, Ukraine is holding on. Now, do you think that's strategic or symbolic?
What I've read, obviously, there's like two schools of thought at the moment surrounding this defense. One is that it is important to keep this kind of defense line going and to strike when the time is ready with the counteroffensive by Ukrainians, not actually in Bakhmut, but elsewhere. And then there is the school of thought that Ukraine is, let's say, wasting too much of its own resources defending this place, and it would be, let's say, more rational in order to retreat. But we have seen that the Ukrainian leadership, military and political, is aligned on this issue, that the town should be defended as of now. I mean, in this near kind of period. So I have full, I'd say, trust in the Ukrainian political and military leadership.
And on the Russian side, of course, it is much more political, because you have Prigozhin, you have a struggle between Prigozhin and Gerasimov in the military. You have those two sort of centers of power competing, jostling for attention. You know, the standard Russian military has not been able to get many or any victories really in this war. And you get the sense that they're lining up as potentially Putin's successors. There's this kind of jostling there. So it's much more symbolic and, I dare say, political on the Russian side, isn't it?
That is a good point to make when people, for example, say that Ukrainian political leadership is somehow interfering, let's say, in the defense of Bakhmut against military leadership. It's not this kind of system. It's a democratic system in which Vladimir Zelensky is not some kind of an authoritarian figure who can like switch generals that easy or make some purges in the military, force them to do something that they as professionals wouldn't do, that which would hurt their interest and sacrifice soldiers' lives. So it's not that kind of a system to begin with. So Zelensky can just like throw soldiers' lives away at a whim in order to, let's say, increase his ratings or something like that. He can't do that. He's not as powerful a figure as, for example, like Putin is in Russia, and obviously Putin can give out more or less any kind of order, and obviously certain parts of the elite military and political would want to fulfill this order in order to look good. Obviously, we're talking up to a point when Putin's, let's say, authority is not checked or challenged. And as of now, it hasn't been challenged yet. And yes, we see this kind of infighting. And I think this is going on literally with Putin's knowledge. He obviously knows who Prigozhin is. He knows that he has given him a sort of a free rein in this kind of military aspect. And Prigozhin, yes, he wants to prove to Putin and to everyone else that he's a strong figure who they have to reckon with. I don't really believe that he has big chances of succeeding Putin or anything like that. But he has obviously been empowered by Putin. Putin has created his sort of paramilitary next to his official military. And obviously, maybe this is, if you look at it from a certain perspective, this could be a really baffling, weird kind of meritocracy. And obviously, it's an authoritarian meritocracy. You couldn't really find that anywhere much else in the world. But yes, we have like a paramilitary and an official military, and they're proving themselves to Putin. They have like Shoigu and Gerasimov on one side, and you have Prigozhin, you have also Kadyrov on the other side, maybe not in a tandem, but they do support each other, but they should be viewed separately because they have different roots. Kadyrov is rooted in Chechnya. He has his power stems from there, and Prigozhin's power literally stems from Putin. Without Putin, he doesn't have anything to fall on. But you also have obviously an official military, you have security forces, different security forces. So they're all kind of competing, and this is what Putin does. He turns people against each other. So he's actually creating this sort of a microcosmos in which they are fighting each other, and they are striving to fulfill some goals. And obviously, goals have obviously been shrunken since the beginning of the invasion. There were huge goals like installing a new, let's say, puppet government, Kiev, and they have been shrunk since then into capturing these small towns or villages in Donbass, or in order to capture or conquer the entire Donbass region. So Putin has something to provide as proof that he has, or under quotes, won this war. And obviously he has been looking for an off-ramp all this time, but not an off-ramp in which he retreats back to Russia's borders, but off-ramp under his own terms, an off-ramp, and he keeps the Donbass or some kind of land corridor to Crimea. That's why probably Ukraine's counteroffensive, new great counteroffensive, it would probably, in my mind, strike when Russia is weakest, and that's the land corridor in south of Zaporozhye region. To split the front in two. That's just my opinion, and from what I've read of experts, that would be a logical place to strike. Let's say an easier and more lucrative target than going to the Donbass region when the situational forces and defensive lines are stronger. Say.
And it may be that the generals and Prigozhin, they may in their own minds already realize that Russia is going to lose, and they may just be positioning themselves not to be the fall guys, not to be the people who were pivotal in that loss. So if Prigozhin can hold on in, get a victory or something, and the front collapses in another place, then that puts him in a better position when when they're potentially competing for Putin's throne. No one knows how that's going to happen, but these kind of calculations must be going on in their heads.
Yes, well, Prigozhin, it's a criminal type from the 90s. You have all sorts of types surrounding Putin. You have technocrats, which are actually very educated, highly skilled professionals without moral basis. You have them, so people who are ready to fulfill various tasks. They aren't bothered by ethics or conscience, obviously, but they're also not supportive of all-out confrontation. Well, anything that would jeopardize stability or status quo or their own the areas like for economy, for example, or the finances, or well, you can have them in various fields, not only in the economy or finance, maybe in administration too. You have literally simply corrupt people who have been with Putin for like a long time, or people who are like in the middle or starting only in the Communist Party in the end of the 80s, and have just rose up as bureaucrats who really have nothing more or less to offer anyone but their loyalty to Putin. You have lots of these people. These people can be very corrupt. They can have influence over certain, well, let's say, regional aspects. No, you can have them like Volodin, for example, or Matvienko. These are the kind of people who they don't have any more or less expertise in anything, but they are corrupt and they are loyal up to a point. When Putin loses the authority, then they will obviously scatter. But you have, as I said, competent people like Nabiullina from the central bank, like Mishustin, the prime minister, who is involved in area of taxes. He has made reforms there, and he is a competent leader. These are the people who can carry out tasks, as I said, but they have no moral or ideological basis to fall on. So they're waiting for the right moment to, let's say, make their move. And you have these kind of people like Prigozhin, for example, or Kadyrov, who literally depend on Putin, and they have blood on their hands. Literally, Kadyrov has persecuted many people in Chechnya who are against his rule. And you have Prigozhin, who was in actual criminal sentence and who carried out, who was in jail during the 90s. He served his sentence, and he has been given rein by Putin as of now to carry out this paramilitary wing, sort of an organization, which is obviously not some kind of a private company, because you don't have influential private companies in any sectors today in Russia. You can have this. And you also don't have many people confuse this. And obviously, there has been like a tradition of language now, but there aren't actually any more oligarchs in Russia, because being an oligarch supposes that you have some kind of influence of political decision making. And these people who have a stake at big Russian companies, corporations, they don't have an actual say. They're, let's say, Putin's puppets in many ways, and their wealth and their position depend on what Putin says or wants to do. And so they weren't asked, oh, what is your opinion? Should I invade Ukraine now or not? As well as technocrats, they also, maybe they have been consulted in ways, how do we keep the ruble, our currency, let's say, above board, not to crumble? How do we stop inflation from raging? How do we stop GDP or from falling too radically? Or how do we stabilize our economy? These are the kind of questions. Or how do we, let's say, insert these laws that are authoritarian but without great protest? This is the kind of tasks, let's say, technocrats are given. But they are not asked, do you think that I'm smart? Do you think that I'm clever? Do you think that I'm making the right decision? This is more for the inner circle of Putin, people like Patrushev, people like Kovalchuk, people like the Rothenberg brothers, who are oligarchs who are very close to Putin and have his ear. These are the people who let's say, Putin can consult with. He wants to fall back on them, but you also had this kind of echo chamber created, and also in the FSB, certain, let's say, parts of the FSB, obviously, we understand there are many departments and they have many sorts of tasks. These are the tasks that have the foreign intelligence. So during the years have passed, and obviously every authoritarian, well, it's let's say it's kind of it's an ubiquitous kind of factor that has been going on since the beginning of time, when you have like an emperor or a king, and he's young and he's full of energy. He does some great deeds, let's say, for example, then he gets older, and obviously he gets corrupt or tyrannical, or he makes this is like from ancient Greece or ancient Babylon to our periods of time.
Paranoia, that's another characteristic, isn't it, of
Some kind of
ancient
an
tyrants? Yeah.
kind of paradigm. And a leader gets corrupted. He gets weaker. He makes worse decisions, and this is the sort of thing. This is just a comparison, but obviously this is a kind of a process which happened to Putin. He might have made riskier but decisions before, but decisions which paid off, like annexing Crimea, or in getting involved in military intervening in Syria, for example. These kind of gambits paid off for Putin. Maybe they were more thought out, but there were also risks obviously involved with this. All of these moves could also have backfired. They didn't, but they could have. And he simply thought that he could also pull off this kind of move, and this would be a grand move, a grand jewel in his, let's say, legacy and his career as a dictator, and dictator emperor, as he probably perceives himself right now, because we shouldn't kid ourselves. People can be corrupt and also have this grand vision of themselves. Yes, you can even start like being corrupt, like Putin started in St. Petersburg, in charge of the port, literally like some sort of a scenario of Batman of Gotham City, when he was involved in this kind of mafia types, and that's when he like introduced himself to Prigozhin and the like, these kind of people. And yes, he has the roots there. Also, obviously, has the roots in the KGB, and not some cool KGB who spies and has all these personas like a genius KGB, but more of a bureaucratic politcommissar of the KGB who stalks other employees of, let's say, his own Soviet employees of embassies, whether they talk to someone else they shouldn't talk to, whether they show some kind of signs of not being ideologically correct or orthodox. He was this kind of a KGB agent. So a person who more like observes other people, other employees, he spies on them, not the James Bond kind of type, and not a genius analyst also kind of type, more of the like The Lives of Others, a great movie, German movie, more of these kind of type, a little man who sits in his like room and listens to other people, stalks them, and then visits some kind of banquets. He's very happy that he can eat shrimp or anything that was a Soviet nomenclature prerogative, while people were waiting for like sausages, basic goods in the streets of Soviet cities at the time. He was this kind of a person, and he started from this. But obviously, when he gained more and more power, he became an autocrat. And obviously, from some point of time, he may as well have began to view himself as some kind of emperor, some kind of a great historical figure, not just a little spy, just a little guy, just some person who's doing these corrupt things and like letting all sorts of contraband through the ports of St. Petersburg. Has become much, much more greater than that. But his system does run on corruption. This is very important. This is like all sorts of American crime shows like The Wire. When someone gets you in, corrupts you, and then obviously you can't get out of this system. If you want to get out, you'll be persecuted, or you'll be thrown out of a window or poisoned or anything else that might befall you if you want to get out. But obviously it's not in your best interest to get out. Well, once you're in, you don't really want to get out. That's why all these people around Putin, all these people who have power, even the technocrats are more or less corrupt, because that's how the Putin system works. And it's possible to corrupt them because the state and Putin is more or less, the state has its fingers in all sorts of economical activity. It holds the majority of shares in all these biggest energy companies, or it controls the oligarchs who have certain stakes in others which the state doesn't officially own, let's say. So you see the wealth being distributed among these people who are parts of the elite. And that's why they supported Putin. That's why they were loyal to him. And they're loyal to him, at least for now, but they also know the risks. They know this adventure was a catastrophic move. They know that they have been cut off from the West. Many of them, as we know, have ties to the West, and many of their children were studying or living or are studying and living in the West. They have property in the West. They have bank accounts in the West, maybe not under their own name, but people who are connected to them, laundering money and such. And they're psychologically tied to the West. They obviously don't want to be tied to China or Iran or North Korea. They aren't impressed by these systems or even these kind of civilizations. You must understand that even if they're some kind of culture racists, yes, they also view the West as core part of the world, and everything else is just some sort of peasants or barbarians living and somewhere else. We're not interested in there. And even if we can go to Dubai and shop there, we really want to go to Geneva, or we really want to go to Biarritz, or whatever kind of high, let's say, class vacation spot you can think of, northern Italy or south of France or say Catalonia. They really want to go there, and not in Dubai or Beijing or Shanghai or anywhere else. They are really attracted to the West. And some of them, obviously, you have people like Patrushev and stuff. I'm not saying that, which are like hardcore Soviet kind of conspiracy theorists. Obviously, if you have populist movements in the West, you have populist movements in Russia, but they are really influenced by the falling or degrading ideology of the Soviet Union from the 70s, let's say, because at one point, Soviet Union had a very attractive ideology, let's say in the 20s or the 30s, before the Stalinist, say, mass crimes were known to the rest of the world, like Holodomor and stuff. Obviously, lots of things that were going on were just, people in the West only heard bits from certain journalists, and they weren't really able to put the entire image together. But obviously, the idea of social justice and modernizing society, there was an appeal to that idea. But obviously, when we fast forward to 1970s, the appeal was lost not only in the West, but in the Soviet Union. Many people had lost their faith in the ideology, in the communist ideology, and what it could bring. Obviously, in this new world, this new paradise that they were building on Earth, this didn't happen, and they lost the faith that it would happen. And lots and lots of conspiracy theories arose from this period of time, how the West was viewed. Obviously, in the beginning, in the 1920s, you have like Mayakovsky and all these poets, and even film directors, like obviously there were silent films, but you have all these films that were in awe of the United States of America, of New York. They didn't like the system, the capitalist system, but they liked the modernization, like the tall buildings, the industry, the cars. They're in awe of this. And in the 70s, there weren't all of these people which were tied to Soviet nomenclature. If they were corrupt, okay, obviously they wanted to be tied with the West somehow, or they wanted to live nice. But these people who were actual believers, or they were young at the time, and they were believers, they obviously believed that the West was a corrupt system, and really began to it was diverted from the communist ideology as such, from the ideals, to just simply hating, let's say, United States of America and everything that was connected to it, and everything that was happening in the West or the East. Everything was a great CIA conspiracy, American conspiracy. Every capitalist was a CIA spy or was working for the US government. Everyone was connected somehow to the United States of America. And these people, and Putin is one of them, they really have this kind of simplified view of the West. And possibly some new layers were added, like this kind of Orthodox heretical teachings, in which like Russia is the savior of the world in a sort of way. The West is morally corrupt. Well, a part of this is also present in the populist circles in the West, right? This culture wars, let's say, targeting everyone who's for some kind of a more tolerant society as being a cultural Marxist or being a wokist or whatever kind of, let's say, derogatory term is popular now in these circles. So you have this kind of an amalgam. Obviously, these kind of ideals from the spy conspiracy, Soviet ideals from the 70s have evolved into this kind of a centaur, great monster. And yes, I definitely believe that Putin and Patrushev and people like this have this worldview. I definitely believe that, and I definitely believe that they believe that West is weak, West is divided, West won't protect Ukraine, won't, when they see what's happening, see the Russian might, when they calculate the risks of decoupling from Russian energy, that they would not find it in themselves the strength to, let's say, confront Russia, confront Putin. And I believe that this was also part of the calculus, not only that Ukraine was weak, they perceived to be weak, perceived its society perceived to be divided, that there was a great part of society to welcome Russian soldiers and stuff, that there was a part of Ukrainian political scene that would support Russia's invasion and would become the core of the new puppet government that was envisioned. But also, obviously, a part of this calculus was not only tied to Ukraine, but to West. And that the West won't react as it reacted. And yes, we have voices in the West who really, really support Ukraine and say we are doing too little, too slow. And okay, they may be right in the way that if the West reacted even more intensely, even more strong, maybe the war would have ended already, maybe in 2022. But there are also greater risks involved in this, in a way that there is always some kind of fear of, say, nuclear conflict in Russia. Whatever one might say that Russia being corrupt, inefficient, and stuff, it does have a nuclear arsenal, that this is a fact. And obviously, leaders have to take this into account. They cannot act, let's say, without responsibility, irresponsibly. And yes, the Biden administration, to my mind, has made the right decision in order to support Ukraine, but not in a way that would, let's say, intentionally trigger some sort of a World War III scenario. Obviously, it wouldn't be the fault of Ukraine or Biden's administration if this would happen. It would be Russia's and Putin's fault, but everyone is trying to avoid this scenario. But this doesn't mean, obviously, that Western decision makers should be scared of Russia. They shouldn't support Ukraine, give it what it needs. But there was obviously a kind of, let's say, treading lightly kind of strategy. And I think this is a prudent strategy. We would all like maybe, okay, I personally, I'm an emotional person. As you can see from my tweets, probably, I am an emotional person. My views are sometimes radical. Maybe I would have wanted things to move faster, but I can put myself in the shoes of a leader. And obviously, a leader has to pay attention to his interior politics. He has to understand that part of society maybe doesn't want this kind of extreme, let's say not extreme, but intense conflict. This scares people. This has so panic. People are starting, why are we getting involved so much? So you have to pay attention to interior politics. You have to get the allies on board on the exterior part of the politics, foreign politics side. You obviously have to have consultations with the Ukrainian side, because Ukraine, whatever Russian propaganda says, is not a proxy or a puppet or anything else of the United States. So you have to have these kind of consultations with them. Obviously, Ukraine is sometimes going to do things that you won't condone or you don't think it's a good idea, like some kind of covert operations, maybe on Russia's border, maybe with drones, maybe with some kind of partisan activity, maybe some rocket strikes. Ukraine has its own leadership, or own, say, ideas, strategies. They don't always 100%. They cannot be, let's say, equal every time or equated with the West. It's normal when people or Russian propaganda say it's a proxy war. No, it's just interests go parallelly, flow. At one point, the West and the United States obviously has a security interest to protect Europe from authoritarianism, from expanding empires. As such, the United States have the same kind of interest, like together with South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, to protect democracies and their independence and even economic interest in the Far Eastern theater, obviously.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because Russian leaders put all sorts of cynical motivations onto the West. In some ways, they project their own cynical motivations onto Western politicians. On the other hand, the West tends to have sometimes quite a naive way of looking at political situations. And we try to find sort of heroes in this belief in, fairy tale democracy. And don't get me wrong, no, I think striving for democracy is exactly the right thing, and we should be projecting our values, and we should be constantly working and improving our own democratic systems, because they're clearly not perfect. But we try to look for heroes, don't we? And a good example of that would be Solzhenitsyn, someone who we held up as being, this great writer, which of course he was, and a great sort of dissident fighting the Soviet regime. I mean, he was also an extreme Russian nationalist with some very bizarre ideas. And even this week, we have the case of Navalny, who is almost uncritically, covered in the Western media, again, as a kind of saint or hero figure. And Ukrainians are incensed. I mean, they may be possibly, not giving him any leeway at all. But they point out he also has an extreme nationalist past. He has, until recently, he was making extremely ambiguous statements about Crimea and about various Russian imperial adventures. He's in the past used some pretty horrific racist terms for, I think, people of Central Asia and Georgia, etc. So he has some extremely questionable views, which he has put out some statements that are trying to clarify this and project a more liberal persona onto the world. But the West does seem to idealize, our enemies' enemies. Where do you sit in this? Because I know, you're not quite as critical as I think as some Ukrainians are, but again, you're not looking at this situation as being, almost like a sort of fairy tale story, as many in the West seem to want to see it as.
Well, this kind of portrayal, like the hero kind of saga, it's a normal kind of media strategy. Yes, if you want to prop up a certain political candidate or a dissident or a political prisoner and such, or opposition figure, you would kind of put him in this kind of a Hollywood frame. And there's the evil dictator, he's the epitome of evil. And then you have this good character, the good guy, who is struggling, fighting to bring everything moral or good again. And obviously, yes, in real life situations, we don't get to have such a perfect black or white kind of scenario. I understand the fear behind this. Obviously, from the Ukrainian point, Ukraine is under attack right now. Obviously, everything coming out of Russia would be scrutinized, which is normal, because this is an existential war for Ukraine. It's not only are their lives threatened and their livelihood and their families and economy as a whole is threatened, even electricity or heating is threatened, but also the cultural identity, national identity, and stuff connected with that. Obviously, Ukrainians are under great threat and great danger at the moment. So anything coming out of Russia is being scrutinized, which is natural, normal kind of reaction. People are actually under attack. We are having intellectual debates and stuff, but we aren't under attack. We aren't in imminent danger in any kind of way. So we can afford this kind of luxury, which Ukrainians cannot. Ukrainians are also being rational. This isn't only an emotional reaction. I don't want it to come off as this. Ukrainian criticisms of Navalny are rational in the sense that Russia has had a troubled autocratic history with very, very brief periods of some, say, democracy striving. I wouldn't even say democratic periods. You had a period from 1905 till the First World War, well, when democracy could have arisen in Russia, but it didn't. But you had at least a multi-party parliament. You had discussions, heated discussions in the parliament, but we didn't have this kind of evolution. We had the February Revolution, but we didn't have it evolve into a formed democratic system. We saw that authoritarianism quickly returned, only under a guise of a different ideology. Then we had the 19th period, where we also had some sort of a fledgling democracy, which was quickly stifled during the end of the 90s already. But we also had the Chechen wars and already back then. So we didn't really have any kind of democracy in Russia that we would say that this is an actual democratic period. We had only these kind of democratic stems, two democratic stems in history that has been going on, let's say, from the 17th or 16th century, if we go back to Ivan Grozny. So I mean, the terrible. Yeah. So this isn't really encouraging. And we also, this isn't only a historical question, this is a question of society. Obviously, we do not have a clear pro-democracy majority right now inside of Russian society. So yes, it would be a great temptation, let's say, if Navalny would get power, what would he do with this power? Would he become the new emperor? Or would he strive to build political institutions to build a competitive democracy, multi-party democracy, to build an actual federalized Russia, which has all these checks and balances, not only in the parliament, not only from different parties in opposition, but also from the region. And obviously, we understand that Russia is not a homogeneous, ethnically homogeneous country. 20% of Russia's citizens do not really belong to the Russian ethnicity or nation, let us say. They have their own republics, but as of now, they have more autonomy on paper than in reality. And on paper, they really do not have this kind of wide autonomy. So yes, you would need a strong parliament, multi-party parliament, but you would also need a strong federalization in order for Russia to remain democratic once some kind of a transition has happened. And yes, you can fear if Navalny is such a, let's say, charismatic figure, an attractive political figure for the Russian electorate, how would he use this power? How would he come off as a leader? Would he step down after, say, 8 years or 10 years in power when these institutions have been formed enough? And he would say, enough, I do not want, it doesn't matter if he's a great success or not so successful, he should step down in any case, obviously, because another cult of personality would be formed. So these kind of questions are normal. We have seen Russia's history, we have seen Russia's society. Yes, I agree that Navalny, let's say 15 years or more ago, has made these kind of statements and has been involved in nationalist rallies. Yes, and he has made these kind of clips even against migrants. These kind of clips are like what Le Pen would do in France or Trumpists would do in America. They're really quite shocking if you translate them, and comparing people from the Caucasus as cockroaches or insects that should be exterminated. And obviously he didn't say that they all should be exterminated, but he went through he gave a stereotype as like people from the Caucasus are criminals, and there are some kind of dangers, as if someone in America would say that African Americans are criminals and they're threatening white people in America. I don't know, it is a kind of statement like that.
Well, let's not forget, Trump said that about Mexicans. He actually said that over and over and over again.
Like some kind of a, let's say, stereotype, which isn't actually even been confirmed by data, because obviously most of the crimes committed in Russia are committed by Russians, and kind of migrants, and people from the Caucasus are not at all. Most of the time there aren't even migrants because they come from the northern Caucasus, and which is the part of Russia. So yes, he was this kind of national populist. Obviously, this is a fact, but this happened a long time ago. I understand, can change their views. He hasn't given such statements recently, and I don't think it would be in his best interest. If people say, why hasn't he, let's say, said that he doesn't at all believe and that what he said was evil, I say the Russian electorate is not a very, very tolerant electorate, and no one in Russia would want to say this out loud, obviously. But you have many stereotypes, you have many sort of cultural racist. Well, you have this cultural racism even among Slavic people in Russia. When Russians look down upon Belarusians or Ukrainians, they're also Slavic. They consider them not ethnically different from each other, but some Russians, or many, let's say many Russians, can consider themselves like the carriers of a great culture. Say Belarus, and they can consider Belarusians and Ukrainians carriers of some kind of a lower folk culture that doesn't really equate to their great imperial Russian culture. But they also look down, obviously, in a racist, openly racist way, from people from the Caucasus or Central Asia, as if, well, literally from a 19th century paradigm, as if they were barbarians or something, sort of that literally. And yes, you have many such people. And if Navalny would himself adopt this kind of, let's say, more tolerant woke discourse, it would alienate a lot, let's say, a majority of Russian voters. And this is a fact. So in Russia, you don't have to be a racist, right? But you don't really want to go into this topic too deeply and go into this kind of discourse, because obviously it would not be accepted among the Russian electorate. And this is just the way things are. And I do believe that Russian society can change. So we have seen many societies change over time, but obviously you need a democracy and you need freedom and liberty inside of Russia, inside of the educational system and stuff like that. Over a couple of decades, the generational change. And then you could only see in the society, not only in some kind of an educated part of society, but in the actual part of society, these kind of feelings be spread. And obviously you have this kind of evolution in the West as well. Obviously, if you return into 1920s, probably many people in the West would have racist views or colonial imperialist views. Obviously, this has changed, this has evolved, society is changing. And obviously, you have to have a democratic society and institutions which support this kind of discourse and label as inappropriate discourse, which is full of hate or unacceptable of others, unaccepting of others. So yes, these are great steps which Russian society has to go through. And yeah, as I said at the beginning, maybe we haven't even touched the subject of sexual orientation, gender issues, which are so far away from the Russian society or electorate. No one wants to even come close to these questions and be elected, because
Yeah.
this is how Russian society is.
I mean,
And
even
yes,
before gender issues, Russian society needs to embrace issues of, let's say, violence and discrimination against women, because it's enshrined in law now that you can, under certain circumstances, beat and abuse your partner and not get prosecuted.
there were great
Fully
social, yes,
supported.
yes, I remember when that law was introduced, there were many right-wing circles, even the Orthodox Church at least got involved. They were against this kind of laws, which would protect the women, even children, from being like hit, physically abused. And yes, you really have these. You even have people, female activists, women's rights activists, who are only protecting these women who were abused, and they were put on the foreign agents list. And some of these also NGOs, or many of them, have real trouble functioning right now. And you don't have this kind of system of safe houses, which you have in Europe. When a woman is abused physically, then she can escape this kind of prison her husband or partner has created and look for asylum there. You don't have these kind of places funded by the state in Russia. So you had these kind of NGOs, and even now, and even they are now obviously finding it hard or cannot even function. Yes, so you have these issues. Obviously, during the communist era, you had great leaps forward in the sense that women were equated, they were given education, they could work on many jobs that they couldn't in a, let's say, traditional society. But obviously, things have stopped there. They haven't progressed. At one point, maybe the USSR, the early USSR, was even more progressive than the West in certain areas. But obviously, there was a sexual revolution in the 60s and all these kind of liberation movements in the West that that were developed and further developing further. Feminism has gone through certain, we all know this in political sciences, yes, divided in certain waves. And all of these things haven't never happened in Soviet Union. The situation was frozen. And in Russia, obviously, you had the fledgling civil society, you had a fledgling array of NGOs, but obviously they weren't allowed to progress, they weren't allowed to develop, and now they're actively being stifled, obviously, by the government. And we can only hope, as far as Navalny goes, none of us can say for certain, I know what this person will do if he gets power. We cannot be certain of this, even if he says all the right things, we cannot be certain. We can only say that he is the most popular opposition figure as of now in Russia. And if a certain democratic transition scenario was to be realized, and you would obviously have to have a part of Putin's elites, probably the technocrats, support this kind of transition. And this could only happen if Ukraine inflicted some sort of a defeat on Russia. Maybe the upcoming offensive, Ukrainian offensive, would lead to this. I don't know, none of us obviously cannot say for certain because these are all hypothetical, speculative scenarios. This is a rational, realistic scenario that obviously, if Putin is proved by the Ukrainian military that he cannot get this off ramp on his own terms, and if he would not back down, and he's not one to back down, and this would set him on a very, very dangerous path of escalation that might lead to tactical nuclear use. I am certain that parts of his elites would be very frightened of this scenario, because what would NATO do? Would it be involved there? This would probably get Russia involved in a war in a realistic way when it is transferred to Russian territory and it is a war to the end. And they would be really, really scared of this event. So you can have this domino kind of effect if Ukrainian military is successful enough. Not if it takes Moscow or some kind of outlander scenario. If it, let's say, divides this front in half, deals a real blow to the Russian military. We saw this happen in Kharkov Oblast region. We saw this happen in Kherson in a way. We could even see this happen in Crimea, when if this offensive is successful and this kind of let's say siege from a distance through harassing logistic lines is being realized. This could start this kind of scenario, which then starts off a democratic transition scenario, which then we can have some sort of free elections in Russia. And yes, if we talk who can win this election through the help of technocrats, this theoretical scenario, Navalny is the person who can win. And I don't see any other figure. Maybe we can say, I like Vladimir Kara-Murza better, his views, he's more of an intellectual, he's more of a liberal. I agree. He's about to be sentenced on the 16th of March, obviously, because we all know these are kangaroo courts. So he will be sentenced to some kind of a draconic punishment. And he's also a political dissident. He's also in prison, obviously. But he doesn't have this kind of support from society. He doesn't have this kind of organization. He's not as well known in Russia, in the provinces, in the interior of Russia, as Navalny is. So if you're talking about the opposition, Navalny is the realistic choice. That is why he is being supported by the West, because Western authorities, Western intellectuals, even journalists, they know that Navalny would be better than Putin. They know that he wouldn't start expansionist war, at least in this way. They are sure. They cannot know if he would be successful and if he would want to create a fully democratic Russia. They cannot know this. They couldn't know this as far, how far the reforms of Gorbachev, how far would Gorbachev take these reforms. They couldn't know how far Yeltsin would go. They cannot know this, and they couldn't know this. They obviously picked the lesser of evils. They didn't pick the KGB. They picked I don't know, Yeltsin or Gorbachev, and they're not picking. They are just, this is what is offered, and they have to make a choice as to whom to support from what is being offered. And I understand Ukrainians. The Ukrainian argument is basically, we don't want to be left alone. Let's say it's an imperialist Russia. We don't want the Russian Empire to be rebuilt again by Navalny, for example, or any other kind of figure. But all these matters would be solved after the war by guarantees, maybe Ukraine joining NATO, possibly down the road, even the EU. So these kind of, probably would see that Ukraine has the strongest military in all of Europe at the end. So these kind of issues would be moot at some point, because Ukraine would be protected in other ways, and some sort of a transition in Russia would not in any case be interested in waging these kind of expansionist wars. And if it succeeds in building a democratic Russia, great, then the West can also have a very developed partner relationship with Russia, maybe even integrate it somehow, maybe not. It's Russia's choice and the West's choice. But if it doesn't go till the end through this process, then we would at least have a less malign, less bellicose Russia. And even if some scenario Russia decides to be an isolationist state to build its own civilizational set of values, fine. We should build a wall on our borders from a military standpoint, economic standpoint, empower all these border states that are bordering Russia, and that their safety should be guaranteed. So
Well, that's what I was going to mention, because
it
could get quite messy, couldn't it? Because many of the relationships with Russia's near abroad, relationships with countries in Central Asia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, there are many sort of frozen conflicts which Russia has either helped to create or helped to freeze. Many of the relationships that Russia has politically and economically are built on power relationships, are built on the fact that Moscow has the intent to meddle, and it has the ability to back up its threats. if that recedes, if Russia ceases to be such a sort of meddling imperial power, might you not see quite a bit of chaos in countries bordering Russia? And might you also not see a sort of domino effect of totalitarian systems kind of crumbling, even, say, Belarus, and many more countries seeking to come under a NATO EU umbrella?
Well, there are a couple of regions, for example, there are the Western Balkans, in which Russia is exerting a lesser kind of influence, a weaker kind of influence, but nevertheless it is present. And right now, obviously after the war, its influence, maybe its aggressiveness has increased, but its influence has lessened because it has become toxic. And not even countries like Serbia and stuff can really depend on, rely on Russia's support anymore, because it has become really a burden. If you want to call Russia to help, even in a diplomatic or economic kind of way, it sends a signal to the West that you are also kind of antagonistic to the West, because we are in this kind of a proto-Cold War scenario right now. So for example, if Russia's influence disappears completely in the Balkans, we would simply have peace in the Balkans and integration of the Balkan region, full integration in the EU and NATO system. Well, if we had Russia's influence crumble, for example, in Belarus, obviously we would have democratization in Belarus, because there is a great strive for democratization inside of society. You won't even have to build some sort of organizations and stuff. It's all already present there, supported by many people inside Belarus. So you would have that immediately. Central Asian region, I wouldn't say that it depends on Moscow's support that much. So all these leaders, some of them are more authoritarian, some less. You had democratic, let's say, revolutions like in Kyrgyzstan. Had several democratic revolutions in Kyrgyzstan. You have these kind of isolated countries like Turkmenistan, which doesn't want to get involved in anyone's business. It's like an isolated, very interesting from a political standpoint, isolated autocracy. Sometimes it's called the North Korea of Central Asia. You have these kind of countries. You have Kazakhstan, but Kazakhstan is a big country and can be an influential country, has really a lot of space to grow. It can be economically influential. It's already tied, let's say, it's building ties, and it's tied to China. So it won't crumble, or the country wouldn't crumble immediately if Russia were to fall. Obviously, stronger Russia meddle more. It would meddle less now. Maybe some sort of oligarch connections would be lost, or they would have to be restructured with new Russia resources or economic wise. But I don't think we would see kind of a war scenario, civil war scenario, just because Russia has been democratized. And in the Caucasus region, you all already see that Russia cannot protect, for example, Armenia. And Armenian authorities are aware of this. They are literally voicing this. For example, today, Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, stated that Armenia doesn't want to leave ODKB. The Russian, a lot less institutionalized and weaker funding of NATO, but that ODKB is leaving Armenia in a way that Russia is obviously letting Armenia slide. It's letting it go. It's not protecting it even from Turkey and Azerbaijan. And Armenian authorities are aware of this, and they have to seek allies in the West. But the West, Armenia is a really, really tricky position. No one would like to be in Armenia's position, because it is caught between stronger competitors, let's say. And the West cannot do much about it, because Turkey is also a part of NATO and cannot antagonize Turkey further. Obviously, Turkey has leverage in the Bosphorus, letting Sweden and Finland join NATO, and being the southern flank of NATO, obviously keeping the Middle East or Southeast European region more stable. So Erdogan has a lot of pull. as a part of the West, he also cannot go against the West, but he has leverage, he has space to maneuver. So Armenia is a very, very tricky position. It can no longer depend on Russia, obviously, but it cannot find a strong, stable ally in the West. But as the West gets stronger in this region, as Russia gets weaker, at least I hope we can see some peace there, stability in the internationally recognized borders of the Southern Caucasus, at least that. Yes. So I wouldn't say that this kind of chaos would immediately follow, because we aren't talking about the USSR anymore. These aren't the regions which are directly controlled. Belarus is the most connected with Russia, but it also has a very strong civic society. It has a very strong democracy movement. So society itself could take reign in Belarus at any moment if Lukashenko's regime was not guaranteed by force by Putin's regime.
It points to a very unpredictable situation. It points to all sorts of interesting changes on the horizon, and all of them pivotal on the outcome of the Ukrainian war. Now, I know we're sort of out of time. We've dived into a lot of different sort of political issues in relation to, obviously, Ukraine, the opposition, and I think the fact that you sort of taught and lived in Russia gives you sort of unique perspective on that. I wanted to sort of thank you for your time, and it would be great in future to dive into some of these issues again. But that's been a deeply fascinating conversation, Aleksandar.
Yes, well, thanks again for the invitation. I also hope your viewers would find this our conversation interesting as well.